Some promises are made in whispers, others in the howling wind of a Dakota winter where survival depends on more than just hope. When grief has carved out your heart and left you chopping firewood with bleeding hands, sometimes salvation comes in the form of a giant cowboy who speaks plain truths. Ephraim Cutter stands near 7.5 feet tall, broad as a barn door, with hands that could break a horse's neck or cradle a sparrow. Delilah Marsh, a 30-year-old widow, has spent 2 years surviving on grit after her husband froze to death in the mountain pass. Her homestead is crumbling, her pantry empty, and winter is coming fast. When Ephraim finds her struggling alone, he takes off his hat and makes his vow simple. By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. But when a woman's heart has been frozen by loss, can even the warmest promise melt the ice around it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut through Delilah Marsh's worn woolen shawl like a blade through parchment, carrying with it the promise of a winter that would test every soul on the Dakota frontier. At 30 years old, she had learned that promises were often broken things, scattered like leaves across the endless prairie. Her calloused hands gripped the axe handle tighter as she raised it above another stubborn piece of oak, the wood splitting with a satisfying crack that echoed off the weathered boards of her small homestead. 2 years had passed since Thomas froze to death bringing firewood down from Eagle's Pass, his body found 3 days later by a search party, still clutching the reins of their old mare. The horse had made it home, but Thomas never would. Delilah still wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the gold band tapping against her breastbone with each swing of the axia, steady reminder of what she'd lost and what she still had to lose. The homestead that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to mock her efforts. The roof leaked in 2 places, sending rusty stains down the whitewashed walls she'd painted with such hope 4 years ago. The barn door hung askew on broken hinges, and the chicken coop had lost half its occupants to foxes last month. Every day brought new evidence of her failing battle against the wilderness, yet every morning she rose before dawn to fight it again. Her nearest neighbor, Martha Henley, lived 3 miles east with her husband Carl and their 2 grown sons. They'd offered help more times than Delilah could count, but charity sat heavy on her shoulders like a wet blanket. She'd accepted a basket of preserves last month and felt the weight of obligation for weeks afterward. Pride was sometimes all a person had left, and she guarded hers fiercely. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth made her straighten, shading her eyes against the pale morning sun. A rider approached from the north, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged on horseback. As the figure drew closer, Delilah felt her breath catch in her throat. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the sheer size of the man. Ephraim Cutter sat his massive stallion like a king surveying his domain, though his domain was nothing more than the endless grass and sky that stretched beyond the horizon. Stories preceded him, wherever he went, tales of a man who could lift a full-grown steer with his bare hands, who'd once walked 50 miles through a blizzard to deliver medicine to a dying child, who spoke to horses in a language they seemed to understand. Some folks whispered he had giant's blood in his veins, passed down from the old country where such things were possible. Others claimed he was part Indian, though his hair was the color of wheat fields in autumn and his eyes held the pale blue of winter sky. What everyone agreed on was that Ephraim Cutter was a man apart, not quite fitting into the world of ordinary mortals, yet somehow essential to it. He'd come down from the high country 3 weeks ago, staying at the boarding house in town and asking questions about available land. More than one father had pushed his daughter forward when Ephraim walked down Main Street, but he'd shown no interest in the giggling girls with their carefully curled hair and Sunday dresses. The older women in town had begun to whisper that perhaps he wasn't the marrying kind, but their whispers held more curiosity than condemnation. Now he was here, on her land, and Delilah felt suddenly aware of her patched dress and the strands of dark hair that had escaped her bun. She set the axe aside and wiped her hands on her apron, waiting as he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite its considerable expanse. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. His voice was deep and measured, carrying the weight of careful consideration behind each word. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Mr. Cutter." She inclined her head slightly, maintaining the polite distance that propriety demanded. "You're welcome on my land, though I'm afraid I can't offer much in the way of hospitality." He gestured toward the pile of split wood at her feet, then to the axe in her hands. "Looks like you're preparing for winter. Every day's preparation out here." She followed his gaze to the weathered homestead, seeing it through his eyes, the sagging porch, the cracked window panes, the garden patch where weeds had begun to reclaim what vegetables remained. A person does what they must. Indeed they do. He stepped closer, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, not fear exactly, but recognition of a moment that would change everything. "I've been watching you, Mrs. Marsh." Heat rose in her cheeks. "Sir, not watching like a man watches a woman he means to take advantage of," he said quickly, his large hands turning his hat brim in a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. "Watching like a man watches someone he respects. You've been working this land alone for 2 years, and you're still here. That takes a special kind of strength." Delilah felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from gratitude or exhaustion, she couldn't say. "Strength doesn't fix a leaking roof or fill an empty pantry." "No," he agreed, "but it's the foundation everything else gets built on." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I came here to make you an offer, Mrs. Marsh. Not the kind a woman usually receives from a stranger, but these aren't usual times, and I'm not a usual man." She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold despite the October sun. "What kind of offer?" "The kind that might save us both from spending another winter alone." He took a step back, giving her space to breathe, to think. "I'm 34 years old, Mrs. Marsh. I've got land up in the high country, good grazing land with water rights and timber. I've got money in the bank and skills enough to keep us fed and warm. What I don't have is a wife, and what you don't have is security." The directness of his words hit her like a physical blow. She'd expected many things from this conversation, but not a marriage proposal from a man she'd never spoken to before today. "Mr. Cutter, I know it sounds like madness," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "A man showing up at your door with talk of marriage when we barely know each other's names. But I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't figured out yet." "The heart?" She laughed, though there was no humor in it. "My heart is buried in the cemetery beside the church, Mr. Cutter. What's left is just a woman trying to survive until spring. Maybe that's enough to start with." He put his hat back on, settling it at the angle she would come to recognize as his thinking position. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mrs. Marsh. I'm asking you to let me take care of you, and in return, you can give me the one thing money can't buy." "And what's that?" "A family." The word hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "I want children, Mrs. Marsh. I want to leave something behind when I'm gone, something more than just stories about a giant who lived in the mountains. You're young enough yet, and strong. You could give me sons." Delilah felt the world tilt slightly, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive these past 2 years, began calculating the advantages of his offer. Security, protection, an end to the grinding loneliness that had become her constant companion. But another part of her, the part that still wore Thomas's ring around her neck, recoiled from the idea of replacing him so easily. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Winter's coming whether we're ready or not, Mrs. Marsh. I'll be in town for another week, staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. When you've made your decision, you know where to find me." He mounted his horse with the same easy grace he'd shown in dismounting, but before he could ride away, Delilah found herself calling out to him. "Mr. Cutter?" He turned in his saddle, eyebrows raised in question. "Why me? There are younger women in town, prettier women with dowries and families to recommend them." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "Because when I watched you split that wood, I saw a woman who doesn't give up. That's worth more than all the dowries in Dakota Territory." With that, he rode away, leaving Delilah standing in her yard, with an axe in her hands and a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She picked up another piece of wood and set it on the chopping block, but her hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. Instead, she sank down onto her porch steps and pulled Thomas's ring from beneath her dress, holding it up to catch the light. "What do I do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty air. "What do I do?" The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the yard and carrying with it the scent of snow still weeks away. But for the first time in 2 years, winter didn't seem quite so frightening. Somewhere in town, a giant of a man was waiting for her answer, and for the first time since Thomas died, Delilah Marsh had something to hope for. 3 days passed before Delilah saw Ephraim Cutter again. 3 days during which his words echoed through every task she performed. She found herself pausing in her work to study her reflection in the cracked mirror above her wash basin, wondering what he'd seen that made him believe she could be the mother of his children. The woman looking back at her seemed too thin, too worn by grief and labor to carry such hopes. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him sitting on her porch steps, his grandfather's pocket watch open in his palm. The timepiece caught the early light, its gold surface engraved with symbols she couldn't read from a distance. He looked up as she opened the door, his expression calm but determined. "Mrs. Marsh." He rose to his feet, closing the watch with a soft click and slipping it into his vest pocket. "I hope you'll forgive the early hour." "You've been waiting long?" She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, conscious of her hair hanging loose down her back and her bare feet on the cold floorboards. "Long enough to watch the sun come up." He gestured toward the eastern horizon, where pink and gold painted the endless sky. "It's beautiful country, even in its harshness. A good place to raise children." The directness of his return to the subject made her breath catch. "Mr. Cutter, I know you haven't decided yet." He stepped closer, and she could smell the leather and pine scent that seemed to follow him everywhere. "But I need to tell you something that might help you make up your mind." She waited, her heart beating faster than it should have. "This watch belonged to my grandfather, came over from Norway when he was barely 18 years old." Ephraim pulled the timepiece from his pocket again, holding it so she could see the intricate engravings on its surface. He carried it through 40 years of farming in Minnesota, through bad harvests and good ones, through the death of 2 wives and the raising of 6 children. When he gave it to my father, he said it was more than just a way to tell time. It was a way to remember that every moment matters, especially the ones that shape the future. Delilah found herself drawn to the watch, stepping closer to examine the careful craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. My father carried it for 30 years, until the day he died in a logging accident when I was 22. Ephraim's voice grew quieter, more reflective. "Before he passed, he pressed it into my hand and told me not to give it away until I was ready to give my name to a woman and my life to building something that would last." The implication of his words settled between them like morning frost. "And you think I'm that woman?" "I think you're a woman who understands that time isn't something to waste." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm 34 years old, Mrs. Marsh. Most men my age already have wives and children, already have roots planted deep enough to weather any storm. I've spent too many years waiting for the right moment, the right woman, the right circumstances. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you fight for what's yours, even when the odds are against you, that told me everything I needed to know." Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You barely know me. I know you rise before dawn to tend animals that barely give enough milk to keep you fed. I know you mend your own fence posts and patch your own roof, even when the work is too much for one person. I know you've been wearing the same dress for 3 days because you've got only 2 that aren't patched beyond repair. His voice was gentle, without judgment. And I know you loved your husband enough to wear his ring around your neck 2 years after he died. She touched the chain at her throat instinctively, feeling the familiar weight of Thomas's ring. Love doesn't die just because a person does. No, it doesn't. But life goes on whether we're ready for it or not. Ephraim pocketed the watch again, his expression growing more serious. Mrs. Marsh, I'm not asking you to forget your husband or stop loving his memory. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you build something new. Something that honors what you had while reaching toward what you could have. The words hung in the cool morning air like a promise and a challenge combined. Delilah found herself thinking of the empty rooms in her house, the silence that pressed against her in the evenings when work was done, and there was nothing left but memories and regret. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Cutter? Marriage, partnership, a future that doesn't depend on whether you can chop enough wood to keep from freezing. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm proposing that by winter, you'll have my son growing inside you, and by spring, you'll have a family again. The boldness of his statement should have shocked her, but instead it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. There was something reassuring about his certainty, his willingness to speak plainly about desires most people only whispered about in the dark. And if I can't give you children, if my body isn't willing or able, then we'll face that together, the way married people do. His answer came without hesitation. But I've seen how you care for your animals, how you tend your garden, even when the soil fights you. You've got the heart of a mother, Mrs. Marsh. I believe your body will follow where your heart leads. Delilah turned away from him, looking out over the land she'd fought so hard to keep. The morning light revealed every flaw, every place where her efforts had fallen short. But it also showed the places where she'd succeeded, the vegetable patch that had yielded enough to keep her fed, the chicken coop she'd repaired with her own hands, the firewood stack that proved she wouldn't give up without a fight. People will talk, she said finally. People always talk. The question is whether you care more about their opinions than your own survival. She faced him again, studying the steady confidence in his expression. You make it sound simple. Some things are simple, even when they're not easy. He stepped back, giving her space to think. I'm not a romantic man, Mrs. Marsh. I won't court you with flowers and poetry, but I'll work beside you, protect you, provide for you, and when you're ready, truly ready, I'll love you with everything I have. The promise in his words made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. When was the last time anyone had offered to take care of her? When had she last felt like someone valued her enough to make such a commitment? How long would you want to wait? For the wedding, I mean. As long as you need, but winter's coming fast, and I'd rather have you settled in my house before the snow gets too deep to travel. His practical concern touched something deep in her chest. 2 weeks. 3. 1, she heard herself say, the word coming out before she'd fully decided to speak it. 1 week. His eyebrows rose slightly. You're certain? No. The honesty surprised them both. But I'm certain that another winter alone will kill me, one way or another. And I'm certain that you're offering me something I didn't dare hope for. What's that? A chance to live, instead of just survive. Ephraim's face softened, and for a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the imposing exterior, someone who'd been waiting as long as she had for a reason to hope. Then it's settled. 1 week from today, if you'll have me. 1 week. She extended her hand, and he took it carefully in both of his touch warm and surprisingly gentle for hands so large. But I have conditions. Name them. I keep my name until after the ceremony, and I keep this house, at least for now. I need to know I have somewhere to come back to if it doesn't work between us, he finished. Agreed. Though I hope you'll find my house more comfortable than this one, especially once winter sets in. She thought of his mention of land in the high country, of water rights and timber, of a place built to shelter a family through the harsh months ahead. Where exactly is your property? About 20 miles north, in the foothills below Eagles Pass. The same mountains where Thomas had died, she realized with a start. Good hunting, good grazing, and a spring that runs year-round. I've been building the house for 3 years, always thinking someday I'd have a wife to share it with. And now you will. Now I will. He released her hand but didn't step away. Mrs. Marshall, I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. Marriage is a sacred thing, not just a business arrangement. When I give you my name and you give me yours, it'll be with the intention of making it permanent. The seriousness in his voice made her chest tight. I understand. Do you? Because once we're married, once you're carrying my child, there won't be any going back to the way things were. You'll be mine, and I'll be yours, for better or worse. The possessiveness in his words should have frightened her, but instead it sent an unexpected thrill through her veins. When had anyone claimed her so completely? When had she belonged to someone who would fight to keep her? I understand, she repeated, and this time she meant it fully. He nodded, satisfied. Then I'll speak to Reverend Morrison this morning, make the arrangements. Is there anything special you'd like for the ceremony? Simple, just simple. She paused, thinking. And I'd like Martha Henley to stand with me if she's willing. Of course. I'll ask Carl to stand with me. He settled his hat back on his head, preparing to leave. 1 week, Delilah. 1 week, and everything changes. After he rode away, Delilah sat on her porch steps and pulled out Thomas's ring, holding it up to catch the morning light. The gold was worn smooth from years of wear, a simple band that had represented simple promises. But perhaps it was time for something more complex, something that acknowledged the woman she'd become rather than the girl she'd been. 1 week. In 1 week, she would be Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, and by winter, if he was right, she would be carrying his child. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. The next morning brought Martha Henley to Delilah's door before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, her face flushed from the 3-mile ride and her eyes bright with curiosity. She tied her horse to the hitching post with efficient movements, then marched up to the porch where Delilah sat mending a torn petticoat. Well? Martha planted her hands on her hips, a gesture Delilah had seen countless times over the years of their friendship. Are you going to make me guess? Or are you going to tell me why half the town is talking about Ephraim Cutter visiting your place twice in 4 days? Delilah set down her needle and thread, meeting her friend's expectant gaze. He's asked me to marry him. Marry him? Martha's voice rose an octave. Delilah Marsh, you've barely spoken 2 words to that man in your entire life. We've spoken plenty in the past few days. Delilah rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. And I've accepted. Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Finally, she sank down onto the porch step, her usual composure completely abandoned. You've lost your mind. The grief has finally addled your brains. My brains are fine, thank you. Delilah resumed her seat, picking up her mending again. My circumstances, however, are not. Your circumstances? Martha turned to study the homestead with fresh eyes, taking in the sagging roof, the patched walls, the general air of barely controlled decay. Oh, Delilah, how bad is it? The concern in her friend's voice broke through the defensive walls Delilah had built around her situation. Bad enough that I won't survive another winter alone. Bad enough that marrying a stranger seems like the wisest choice I've made in 2 years. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her practical nature warring with her protective instincts. Tell me about him. Really tell me, not just the stories everyone whispers. He's direct, honest to the point of bluntness. He wants children, and he believes I can give them to him. Delilah paused in her stitching, thinking of the way Ephraim had looked at her, not with the pity she'd grown accustomed to, but with something that might have been respect. He's offering security, Martha. A real home, not just a place to survive until the next disaster strikes. And what are you offering him? The question hung between them like morning mist. What was she offering? A worn-down widow with calloused hands and a heart still wrapped around the memory of another man. Whatever he needs, she said finally. A wife, a mother for his children, someone to stand beside him when the world gets hard. Martha reached over and stilled Delilah's restless hands. And what about love? What about it? The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. Love didn't keep Thomas warm when the storm caught him in the pass. Love didn't pay the bills or fix the roof or put food on the table after he died. Maybe it's time I chose something more practical. You love Thomas. I still love Thomas. Delilah pulled her hands free, touching the chain at her throat. I'll always love Thomas. But Thomas is dead, and I'm alive, and Ephraim Cutter is offering me a chance to stay that way. Martha was quiet for several minutes, her gaze moving over the familiar landscape of Delilah's daily struggle. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. When? 1 week. We'll have a simple ceremony at the church. 1 week? Martha's eyebrows shot up. Delilah, that's barely enough time to... To what? Plan a wedding feast we can't afford. Order a dress I'll never wear again. Send invitations to family who live too far away to come. Delilah set her mending aside, suddenly restless. What's the point of waiting, Martha? To give myself more time to change my mind? To let doubt creep in and convince me I'm making a mistake? Are you making a mistake? It was the question that had kept Delilah awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the loose boards of her house. Was she trading one kind of uncertainty for another? Was she being fair to Ephraim, marrying him when her heart still belonged to a dead man? I don't know, she admitted, but I know what happens if I don't try. I know what winter alone looks like, and I can't face it again. Martha nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. What do you need me to do? The simple question, offered without judgment or condition, brought tears to Delilah's eyes. Stand with me? Be my witness when I make this choice? Of course. Martha reached over and squeezed her hand. And afterward, when you're Mrs. Ephraim Cutter and living 20 miles away in the mountains? I don't know, Delilah said again. I suppose I'll learn to be someone new. They spent the rest of the morning going through Delilah's belongings, deciding what could be packed and taken to her new home and what would be left behind. It was a sobering process, seeing the accumulation of 6 years of marriage reduced to a few boxes and bundles. In the back bedroom, Martha discovered Thomas's unfinished rocking chair, the wood smooth from hours of careful sanding, but still lacking the final touches that would have made it complete. The sight of it stopped both women in their tracks. He was making it for the children we planned to have, Delilah said softly, running her fingers over the curved armrest. He worked on it in the evenings, always saying he'd finish it when we had news to celebrate. What will you do with it? Delilah considered the question, thinking of the hope that had gone into each careful cut, each smoothed surface. Take it with me. Maybe Ephraim can finish what Thomas started. The symbolism of the statement wasn't lost on either of them. Martha wrapped the chair carefully in an old quilt, treating it with the reverence due to dreams deferred but not entirely abandoned. As they worked, Martha shared news from town, who was courting whom, which families were planning to head back east before winter set in, what the traveling preacher had said about the state of everyone's souls. Normal gossip, the kind that had once formed the backbone of Delilah's social world. You know, people will talk, Martha said as they folded Delilah's good dress into a trunk. People always talk. Ephraim said the same thing. And you don't care? Delilah considered the question. 2 years ago, the opinion of her neighbors had mattered greatly. Now, faced with the choice between respectability and survival, the answer seemed clear. I care more about making it through the winter than I do about what Mrs. Patterson thinks of my choices. Martha laughed. Mrs. Patterson's been trying to marry off her daughters to Ephraim Cutter since he came to town. She'll be apoplectic when she finds out you caught him. I didn't catch him. He chose me. The distinction mattered, though Delilah couldn't quite explain why. He could have had any unmarried woman in 3 counties, but he came to me. Why do you think that is? It was another question that had kept Delilah awake, turning over Ephraim's words, about seeing strength in her struggle, about recognizing something in her that others had overlooked. He said he was looking for someone who doesn't give up, someone who fights for what's theirs, even when the odds are against them. And that's you? Delilah looked around the bedroom she'd shared with Thomas, at the faded wallpaper and the window that let in drafts no matter how she tried to seal it. She'd fought for this place, bled for it, nearly died for it, but what had that struggle accomplished beyond keeping her alive for another day? Maybe it used to be. Maybe it's time to fight for something bigger than just survival. They finished packing in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As Martha prepared to leave, she turned back to Delilah with the expression she wore when delivering difficult truths. I have to ask this, as your friend. Are you attracted to him? To Ephraim? Heat rose in Delilah's cheeks. Martha, it's a legitimate question. You're going to be sharing a bed with this man, bearing his children, if all goes according to plan. Physical compatibility matters, especially in a marriage that's starting without love. The directness of the question forced Delilah to examine feelings she'd been trying to ignore. When Ephraim stood close to her, when his large hands had covered hers, when his deep voice spoke of children and futures, had she felt anything beyond practical gratitude? He's imposing, she said carefully, but not in a way that frightens me. When he looks at me, I feel like he sees something worthwhile, something worth protecting. That's not what I asked. Delilah met her friend's knowing gaze. Yes, I'm attracted to him. God help me, I'm attracted to my dead husband's replacement. Thomas isn't being replaced, Delilah. He's being honored by your decision to keep living. The words were exactly what Delilah needed to hear, even if she wasn't entirely ready to believe them. After Martha left, she sat alone in her nearly empty house and tried to imagine what her life would look like in 8 days. Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, living in a house she'd never seen, sharing a bed with a man she barely knew, committed to bearing children for someone who'd chosen her for her strength rather than her beauty. It should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in 2 years, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. 2 days later, Delilah woke to the sound of hammering on her roof. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Ephraim balanced on the steep slope above her bedroom, replacing the damaged shingles that had been letting in rain for months. His shirt was already damp with sweat, despite the cool morning air, and his movements showed the easy competence of a man comfortable with physical labor. "Mr. Cutter," she shaded her eyes against the sun, calling up to him. "What are you doing?" He paused in his work, looking down at her with that steady expression she was beginning to recognize. "Fixing your roof. Can't have my future wife sleeping under a leak." The possessiveness in his words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he resumed, hammering, driving each nail with precise strikes. "Besides, it gives me something to do with my hands while I wait for Sunday." She watched him work for several minutes, noting the careful way he aligned each shingle, the methodical progress he made across the damaged section. This was a man who finished what he started, who took responsibility for the things and people under his protection. "There's coffee if you want some," she called up to him. "In a bit. Want to get this section done before the sun gets too hot." Delilah went back inside to prepare breakfast, but found herself drawn repeatedly to the window to watch his progress. There was something mesmerizing about the rhythm of his work, the way his large frame moved with surprising grace across the steep roof. When was the last time someone had taken care of her practical needs without being asked? An hour later, he climbed down and joined her on the porch, accepting a cup of coffee and a plate of fried eggs with quiet gratitude. He ate with the focused attention of a man who considered food fuel rather than pleasure, but he complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation. "The roof should hold through the winter now," he said, wiping his mouth with the napkin she'd provided, "though you won't need to worry about that once we're married." "About that," Delilah set down her own cup, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about what happens after. After the wedding, I mean." His eyes sharpened with attention. "Having second thoughts?" "No, but I have questions about expectations, about what kind of wife you're hoping I'll be." Ephraim leaned back in his chair, studying her face with that unnerving directness. "What kind of wife do you want to be?" The question caught her off guard. Thomas had never asked what she wanted. He'd simply assumed she'd be happy with the role of helpmate and eventual mother. But Ephraim was asking her to define herself, to choose her own path within the boundaries of their arrangement. "I want to be useful," she said finally. "I want to contribute more than just my ability to bear children. I can work farm work, household management, even helping with livestock if needed. I don't want to be ornamental." "Good, because I wasn't looking for ornamental." He finished his coffee, then reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I brought you something." Delilah accepted the pouch with curious fingers, noting the soft texture of the well-worn leather and the careful stitching along the seams. Inside, she found an assortment of dried herbs and roots, each wrapped in small cloth packets and labeled in careful handwriting. "Feverfew for headaches," Ephraim explained, pointing to each packet as he spoke. "Willow bark for pain, echinacea for preventing illness, chamomile for sleep troubles, and ginger root for morning sickness when the time comes." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to her eyes. "You made this yourself?" "Learned from my grandmother. She was half Norwegian, half Ojibwe, and she knew more about healing than any doctor I've met." He paused, watching her examine each carefully labeled packet. "A woman living alone needs to know how to take care of herself, especially through a pregnancy." The casual mention of pregnancy sent a flutter through her stomach. "You're very confident that will happen quickly. Are you not?" His question held no judgment, only curiosity. Delilah considered how to answer. She'd been married to Thomas for 4 years without conceiving, though they'd both believed children would come in time. But Ephraim was different from Thomas in every way, imaginable larger, more confident, more direct in his desires. Perhaps those differences extended to his ability to give her what Thomas never had. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Thomas and I tried for years without success. It may be that I'm not able to carry children. Or it may be that you needed the right man to plant the seed." His matter-of-fact tone made the intimate subject easier to discuss. "Either way, we won't know until we try." Heat rose in her cheeks at the implication. In 4 days, she would be sharing this man's bed, learning the most intimate details of his body and his desires. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it sent an unexpected anticipation through her veins. "I should probably tell you," she said carefully, "that my experience with marital relations is somewhat limited." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Limited how?" "Thomas was a gentleman, very considerate of my comfort and my modesty. Our encounters were brief and infrequent, mostly when he hoped to create a child." Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Delilah, I want you to understand something. When you become my wife, when you share my bed, it won't be just for the purpose of making babies. A man and wife should find pleasure in each other, should come together because they desire the connection as much as the result." "I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of response," she admitted, embarrassed by her own honesty. "You won't know until someone takes the time to teach you." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the touch warm and reassuring. "I'm not Thomas, Delilah. I won't treat you like you're made of glass, and I won't apologize for wanting you the way a man wants his wife. But I'll be patient. I'll make sure you're ready before we take that step." The promise in his words made her breath catch. When had anyone spoken to her about her own desires, her own capacity for pleasure? Thomas had been focused on the mechanics of procreation, but Ephraim was talking about something else entirely, about partnership, about mutual satisfaction, about the kind of physical intimacy she'd only heard whispered about by married women. "How patient?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "As patient as you need me to be. Days, weeks, months, if necessary." His thumb traced across her knuckles, the simple touch sending warmth up her arm. "But I hope it won't take that long. I hope you'll find reasons to want me as much as I already want you." The admission hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. He wanted her not just as a vessel for his children or a caretaker for his home, but as a woman. When had anyone last looked at her with desire rather than pity? "I should get back to work," she said, though she made no move to pull her hand away from his. In a minute, he turned her hand over, examining the calluses on her palm with gentle fingers. These will heal once you're not working yourself to exhaustion every day. I like my hands the way they are. They're proof that I can take care of myself. And now you'll have proof that someone else wants to take care of you too. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her palm that made her shiver. 4 more days, Delilah. 4 more days, and you'll never have to face anything alone again. After he left to return to town, Delilah sat on her porch with the medicine pouch in her lap, thinking about the man who'd given it to her. He could have chosen any woman younger, prettier, more experienced in the domestic arts. But he'd chosen her, with her work-worn hands and her guarded heart and her uncertain ability to give him what he most wanted. She opened the pouch again, breathing in the mingled scents of the carefully preserved herbs. Feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, ginger for morning sickness. He was already thinking ahead to her comfort during pregnancy, already planning for the child he believed they would create together. For the first time since accepting his proposal, Delilah allowed herself to imagine it fully, the weight of a baby in her arms, the sound of a child's laughter in the house Ephraim had built, the look on his face when she told him his seed had taken root in her body. The image filled her with a longing so sharp it took her breath away. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe Thomas wasn't being replaced, but honored by her decision to keep living, to keep hoping, to believe that her story wasn't over, but simply beginning a new chapter. 4 more days. In 4 more days, she would be Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, and the careful, cautious life she'd built from the ashes of her grief would transform into something she couldn't yet imagine. She pressed her face into her hands, breathing in the lingering scent of healing herbs, and for the first time in 2 years, Delilah Marsh let herself believe in the possibility of happiness. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline sky that promised snow before nightfall. Delilah woke before sunrise in Martha's guest room, where she'd spent the night to preserve the tradition of not seeing her groom on their wedding day. Through the frosted window, she could see her breath in the chilly air, and she pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders as she tried to calm her racing heart. In a few hours, she would be married to a man she'd known for exactly 1 week. Martha bustled in with a breakfast tray and the determined efficiency of a woman on a mission. "Eat," she commanded, setting the tray on the bedside table. "You'll need your strength today." Delilah attempted to swallow a few bites of porridge, but her stomach was too unsettled to accept much food. Instead, she focused on the simple ritual of preparing herself for the most important day of her new life. Her wedding dress was a simple affair, her best blue wool, freshly pressed and paired with the white lace collar that had belonged to her mother. Martha had insisted on lending her a pair of pearl earrings, something borrowed to bring good luck. In her reticule, she carried Thomas's ring, no longer around her neck, but not yet ready to be completely put away. "You look beautiful," Martha said, stepping back to examine her handiwork after pinning Delilah's hair into a neat chignon. "Different somehow. More hopeful." "I feel different." Delilah studied herself in the mirror, noting the color in her cheeks and the brightness in her eyes that had been absent for so long. Terrified, but different. They arrived at the church to find a surprising number of people already gathered, despite the early hour and the casual nature of the ceremony. Word had spread, as it always did in small communities, and it seemed half the county had turned out to witness the unlikely union of the giant cowboy and the widow who'd captured his attention. Ephraim was waiting at the altar with Carl Henley, both men dressed in their Sunday best and looking uncomfortable in the confines of their formal clothes. But when Delilah walked down the aisle on Martha's arm, Ephraim's expression transformed, his face lighting with something that might have been wonder. "You're beautiful," he murmured, as she took her place beside him, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "You clean up well yourself," she replied, noting how the dark suit emphasized his broad shoulders and made his pale eyes seem even brighter. Reverend Morrison began the ceremony with the traditional words about marriage being a sacred institution designed by God for the comfort and companionship of man and woman. But Delilah found herself focusing more on Ephraim's presence beside Hearth, warmth radiating from his large frame, the steadiness of his breathing, the way his hand felt when he took hers during the exchange of vows. Do you, Ephraim Cutter, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. His answer was firm, unwavering, spoken with the same certainty he'd shown when making his original proposal. And do you, Delilah Marsh, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Delilah looked up into Ephraim's face, seeing patience and hope, and something deeper that made her chest tight with emotion. I do. The ring he slipped onto her finger was unlike anything she'd expected, not gold like Thomas's had been, but silver, with intricate engravings that caught the light from the church's tall windows. She realized he must have made it himself, just as he'd made everything else he'd given her. By the power vested in me by the territory of Dakota, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Ephraim's hands came up to frame her face with surprising gentleness, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones as he leaned down to press his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, reverent, a promise rather than a demand. But even so, it sent warmth flooding through her body and made her understand, perhaps for the first time, what Martha had meant about physical compatibility. When they broke apart, Delilah found herself looking into eyes that held both satisfaction and banked desire. Whatever else their marriage might become, it would not lack for passion on his part. The congregation erupted in applause and well-wishes, and for the next hour Delilah found herself accepting congratulations from people she'd known for years, but who now looked at her with new interest. She was no longer the pitied widow struggling to survive. She was Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, wife to one of the most respected men in 3 counties. Martha had organized a simple reception in the church hall, with coffee and cake and the kind of wholesome conversation that marked significant community events. But Delilah noticed the way some of the older women watched her and Ephraim together, their expressions speculative in a way that made her uncomfortable. "They're wondering if you're already carrying his child," Martha murmured in her ear during a quiet moment. "The speed of your courtship has set tongues wagging." "Let them wonder," Delilah replied, though she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's none of their business." "No, but it will become their business if you start showing before a respectable amount of time has passed." The implication made Delilah's stomach flutter. Tonight, she would share Ephraim's bed for the first time. Tonight, he would attempt to fulfill the promise he'd made about her carrying his child by winter. The thought sent a mixture of anticipation and nervousness through her veins. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself watching her new husband as he moved through the crowd, noting how easily he commanded respect despite his reserved nature. Men sought his opinion on everything from cattle prices to the likelihood of an early winter, while women found excuses to bring him pieces of cake and compliment his choice of bride. But his attention kept returning to her, his eyes finding her across the room with a consistency that made her feel claimed in the most elemental way. When he looked at her like that, she could almost forget that their marriage had been born of practicality rather than passion. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Ephraim approached her with their coats. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Cutter?" The name sent a thrill through her that she hadn't expected. "Yes, I think I am." The ride to his property took them north through increasingly rugged terrain, the wagon loaded with her belongings bouncing over ruts and rocks as they climbed into the foothills. Ephraim had hitched his massive stallion alongside a gentler mare, and the team pulled steadily despite the challenging road. "Tell me about your house," Delilah said, partly to break the comfortable silence, and partly because she was genuinely curious about the place that would be her new home. "It's solid," he said, his attention focused on navigating a particularly treacherous section of trail, built to last, with good timber and stone foundations. 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room for the evenings, Nothing fancy, but comfortable. 3 bedrooms, one for us, one for guests, and one for children when they come. The matter-of-fact way he spoke about their future offspring made her pulse quicken. I've been working on a cradle in the evenings, just rough work so far, but it'll be ready when we need it. The image of him working by lamplight, carving wood into shapes meant to hold their babies, filled her with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When had anyone planned so carefully for her happiness? As they climbed higher, the landscape grew more dramatic, with rocky outcroppings and stands of pine that spoke of wild country and harsh winters. But it was beautiful too, in a way that made her understand why Ephraim had chosen to build his life here. This was a place for people who valued independence, who weren't afraid of solitude or challenge. "There," he said, pointing ahead to where smoke rose from a chimney barely visible through the trees. "Home." Delilah's first sight of her new home took her breath away. It was larger than she'd expected, built of honey-colored logs with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Window boxes held the brown stalks of flowers that had bloomed earlier in the season, and a kitchen garden showed evidence of careful tending, despite the lateness of the year. "Ephraim, it's beautiful. You sound surprised." "I suppose I am. I was expecting something more primitive, I guess. More like a trapper's cabin than a real home." He helped her down from the wagon, his large hands spanning her waist with easy strength. "I told you I'd been building it for 3 years, thinking someday I'd have a wife to share it with. I wanted it to be worthy of the woman who'd live here." Inside, the house was even more impressive. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a carved wooden mantel, and the furniture was clearly handmade but showed real craftsmanship. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though it had the slightly sterile feel of a place where a man lived alone. "I'll show you the rest," Ephraim said, carrying her trunk toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The room that would be theirs was large and airy, with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. The bed dominated the space, a massive 4-poster that had clearly been built to accommodate Ephraim's size. It was covered with quilts in deep blues and greens, and the sight of it made Delilah's mouth go dry with nervousness. "I'll give you some time to settle in," Ephraim said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "There's hot water on the stove if you'd like to wash, and I'll be in the kitchen when you're ready." After he left, Delilah stood alone in the room that would witness the most intimate moments of her new marriage. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe that took up most of one wall, and placing her brush and mirror on the dressing table by the window. In the bottom of her trunk, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, she found the wooden spoon Ephraim had carved for her during their brief courtship. She'd almost forgotten about it in the rush of wedding preparations, but now she held it up to the lamplight, examining the careful work that had gone into its creation. It was a simple thing, practical rather than decorative, but the wood had been polished to a satin smoothness that spoke of hours of patient work. Along the handle, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, were tiny carved flowers, wild roses, she thought, the kind that bloomed in mountain meadows during the brief summer season. The spoon represented everything she was beginning to understand about her new husband, his attention to detail, his commitment to creating things that would last, his quiet way of showing care through action rather than words. When he carved this spoon, he'd been thinking of her hands, of meals they would share, of the domestic intimacy that was already growing between them. She was still holding the spoon when Ephraim knocked softly on the door. "Delilah? Supper's ready if you're hungry." "Coming," she called, quickly placing the spoon on the dressing table where she could see it every morning when she woke. In the kitchen, she found that he'd prepared a simple but substantial meal, venison stew with fresh bread, accompanied by preserves made from wild berries. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, both of them aware that the evening would bring them to the moment they'd been building towards since the day he'd first proposed. "Are you nervous?" he asked finally, setting down his coffee cup and studying her face in the lamplight. "Yes," she admitted, "but not the way I expected to be." "What way are you nervous?" Delilah considered how to explain the complex mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that had been building in her chest all day. I'm nervous that I won't be what you're hoping for, that I won't know how to be the kind of wife you need. And what kind of wife do you think I need? I don't know. Someone warmer, maybe. Someone who comes to your bed with passion instead of duty. Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Delilah, I didn't marry you, expecting you to be someone you're not. I married you because of who you are, a woman strong enough to survive what would have broken most people, honest enough to speak her fears, brave enough to trust a stranger with her future. And if passion doesn't come, if I can't learn to want you the way a wife should want her husband. He rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her so they were at eye level. Then we'll build something else. Respect, companionship, partnership. Not every marriage is based on grand passion, but the best ones are built on trust and genuine affection. Is that enough for you? It's a beginning. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. But I think you might surprise yourself, given time and patience. The promise in his voice made her lean into his touch. And for the first time since accepting his proposal, Delilah allowed herself to believe that their unconventional beginning might lead to something beautiful after all. Their first night as husband and wife passed with surprising tenderness, Ephraim keeping his promise to be patient while still claiming his rights as her husband. When Delilah woke the next morning to find herself curled against his warm chest, she felt changed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical act of consummation, and everything to do with the gentle way he'd introduced her to pleasures she'd never imagined possible. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Ephraim rose before dawn to tend his livestock cattle that grazed in high meadows and horses that roamed freely until winter drove them closer to the barn. Delilah took over the domestic responsibilities with an efficiency that seemed to surprise and please him, transforming his bachelor quarters into something that felt like a real home. She discovered that he was a man of simple tastes but particular standards, appreciating good food and cleanliness without requiring unnecessary luxury. He'd never learned to cook beyond the basics required for survival, so her ability to turn simple ingredients into satisfying meals earned his genuine gratitude. "Where did you learn to make bread like this?" he asked one morning, breaking open a still warm loaf and inhaling the yeasty scent with obvious pleasure. "My mother," she said. A woman who couldn't feed her family properly wasn't much of a woman at all. Delilah poured coffee into his cup, noting how his large hands dwarfed the delicate china. "She taught me that taking care of people through food was one of the highest forms of love. She was a wise woman. She died when I was 17, right before I married Thomas. I sometimes wonder what she would have thought of all this, me marrying a stranger, starting over at 30 years old." Ephraim considered the question while he buttered his bread. "I think she would have been proud that you chose life over despair. That takes a special kind of courage." The simple statement filled her with warmth, though it also highlighted how different he was from Thomas, who'd rarely offered such philosophical observations. Ephraim thought deeply about things, approached even casual conversations with the same thoroughness he brought to his work. After breakfast, while he tended to outdoor chores, Delilah explored her new domain more thoroughly. In addition to the main house, there was a large barn that housed his horses, a smaller building for storing grain and equipment, and a smokehouse that still held the remnants of his summer hunting efforts. Everything was well maintained and organized with military precision. But it was in the back bedroom, the one he'd designated for future children, that she made her most significant discovery. Hidden in the bottom of a trunk, beneath spare blankets and winter clothes, she found her mother's Bible-the-worn leather volume that had guided her family through 2 generations of frontier hardships. She'd thought the book was lost forever, sold with the rest of her belongings when she'd been forced to liquidate Thomas's debts. Finding it here, in Ephraim's house, felt like a sign that perhaps this marriage was blessed in ways she hadn't dared to hope. "You bought it back," she said when he came in for the midday meal, holding the familiar book against her chest like a treasure. "Bought what back?" He hung his hat on the peg by the door, then turned to see what had captured her attention. "Oh, the Bible." How did you know it was mine? Mrs. Patterson mentioned that you'd had to sell some family items to pay debts. I asked around, found the man who'd bought it, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He shrugged as if such thoughtfulness was perfectly ordinary. A woman should have her mother's Bible, especially when she's starting a new life. The gesture was so unexpected, so perfectly attuned to what would matter most to her, that Delilah felt tears spring to her eyes. Thank you. You can't know what this means to me. I think I can. He stepped closer, his expression gentle. We all need something to anchor us to who we were before life changed everything. That evening, after supper had been cleared away and the dishes washed, Delilah sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, not Thomas's unfinished chair, which still waited in the barn for Ephraim's attention, but a simpler one that Ephraim had made for everyday use. She opened her mother's Bible to the family record page, noting the careful entries in her father's handwriting. Births, deaths, marriages, the significant moments that marked a family's journey through time. May I? Ephraim asked, settling into the larger chair beside her. She handed him the book, watching as he examined the family tree recorded in fading ink. His finger traced the names of grandparents she'd never met, parents who died too young, the brief entry that marked her marriage to Thomas Marsh. There's space for more entries, he observed. Yes, she understood what he was suggesting. Soon there would be a new entry, her marriage to Ephraim Cutter. And below that, God willing, the names of children who would carry both their bloodlines into the future. I've been thinking about names, he said, closing the book carefully and handing it back to her. If our first child is a son, I'd like to name him after my grandfather Eric. But I want you to choose the middle name, something from your family. And if it's a daughter, that would be entirely your choice. I know nothing about naming girls. The casual way he spoke about their future children, as if their conception was inevitable rather than merely hoped for, filled her with a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety. It had been 3 weeks since their wedding, 3 weeks of sharing his bed and learning the intimate rhythms of married life. Was it too soon to expect signs that his seed had taken root? Ephraim, she said carefully, what if I don't conceive as quickly as you're hoping? What if it takes months, or even years? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. Then we'll have more time to learn each other, to build the foundation that will make us good parents when the time comes. And if I never conceive? If I'm barren? The question hung between them like a challenge. This was the fear she'd carried since accepting his proposal, that she would fail to give him the one thing he wanted most, that their marriage would become a disappointment to them both. Then we'll find other ways to build a family. There are always children who need homes, who need the kind of love and stability we could provide. He turned to look at her directly. Delilah, I married you because I wanted a partner, not just a broodmare. If children come, I'll be grateful. If they don't, I'll still consider myself fortunate to have found a woman worth sharing my life with. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. You say that now, but what about in 5 years? 10? When your friends have children and grandchildren, and we're still alone? Then we'll be alone together, and that will have to be enough. He reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. But I don't think it will come to that. I have a feeling about us, about what we can create together. What kind of feeling? The kind that tells me our story is just beginning, that the best parts are still ahead of us. He lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. You're going to give me children, Delilah. Maybe not this month or even this year, but someday. And when you do, they'll be lucky to have a mother who knows how to fight for what matters. That night, as they lay together in the large bed that had become familiar despite its strangeness, Delilah found herself thinking about the future Ephraim envisioned with such confidence. Children running through the rooms of this house, filling it with laughter and noise, and the everyday chaos of family life. A daughter with her dark hair and stubborn chin, perhaps, or a son with Ephraim's pale eyes and gentle strength. What are you thinking about? He asked, his voice drowsy in the darkness. The children will have, what they'll look like, what kind of people they'll become. And I think they'll be lucky to have you as a father." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight, filtering through the bedroom window. "You're nothing like what I expected when you first came to my door." "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, I suppose, more demanding. Men your size don't usually develop the kind of patience you've shown me. Maybe that's because most men my size never had to learn patience. When you're as big as I am, people tend to give you what you want without argument. But the best things in life, respect, love, trust, those can't be taken by force. They have to be earned." "Is that what you're doing, earning my love?" "Every day." His answer was simple, honest, devastating in its directness. "Every day I try to prove that I'm worthy of the trust you placed in me when you said yes." 3 weeks of marriage, and already Delilah could feel her carefully guarded heart beginning to soften toward this man who carved spoons and brought back Bibles and spoke of their future with such unwavering certainty. It wasn't the desperate passion she'd felt for Thomas in their youth, but something deeper and more sustainable, growing affection built on respect and genuine compatibility. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was even better than what she'd had before, grounded in adult understanding rather than youthful infatuation. As she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, Delilah allowed herself to believe that their practical beginning might indeed lead to something extraordinary. The knock on their door came on a grey November morning when the first serious snow of the season was beginning to dust the mountains. Delilah was kneading bread dough when she heard horses approaching, followed by the firm rap of knuckles against wood. Ephraim answered, and she recognized the voice of Samuel Morrison, the banker from town. "Mr. Cutter, Mrs. Cutter." Morrison's tone held the careful formality of a man bearing unpleasant news. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a matter that requires immediate attention." Delilah wiped her hands on her apron and joined them in the front room, noting the manila envelope in Morrison's hands and the uncomfortable expression on his weathered face. She'd known Samuel Morrison for 6 years, had borrowed money from his bank to help Thomas buy seed for their first crop. Whatever brought him 20 miles into the mountains on a day like this couldn't be good news. "What kind of matter?" Ephraim asked, his voice carrying the steady calm that had become familiar to her over their month of marriage. Morrison opened the envelope and withdrew a sheaf of legal documents, the papers crackling in the dry air. "It concerns Mrs. Cutter's former property. There's been a development regarding the estate of Thomas Marsh." Delilah felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of development?" "Thomas's debts were settled. I lost the homestead, but everything was paid." "That's what we believed, ma'am. But it seems there was a debt that wasn't properly recorded at the time of your husband's death." Morrison's discomfort was obvious as he consulted the papers. "A promissory note for $800, signed by Thomas Marsh and witnessed by 2 reliable citizens. The creditor has come forward with legal documentation proving the debt's validity." $800? Delilah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Thomas never borrowed that kind of money without telling me." "The debt is dated 6 months before your husband's death, ma'am. According to the documentation, the money was borrowed to purchase seed and equipment for an expanded planting that spring." Delilah's mind raced back to that last spring with Thomas, remembering his excitement about increasing their crop yield, his confidence that a larger harvest would set them up for years to come. She'd questioned the wisdom of expanding so quickly, but he'd assured her he had everything under control. "Who holds the debt?" Ephraim asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A Mr. Jonathan Blackwood. He operates a lending business out of Rapid City, apparently serves clients throughout the territory." Morrison consulted his papers again. "Mr. Blackwood is demanding immediate payment of the principal plus accumulated interest. The total amount owed is now just over $1,000. The figure hit Delilah like a physical blow. $1,000 was more money than most families saw in 2 years, an impossible sum that might as well have been $1 million. "And if the debt isn't paid?" Ephraim's tone had grown even more controlled, which Delilah was learning meant he was fighting to contain his anger. "Mr. Blackwood has the legal right to claim assets equivalent to the debt's value. Since Mrs. Cutter, Mrs. Marsh at the time inherited responsibility for her husband's obligations, and since she's now married to you, the debt legally transfers to your household. What assets is he claiming? Delilah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison looked even more uncomfortable. Your current homestead, Mr. Cutter, this property and all structures on it. Mr. Blackwood's assessment places the value at approximately $1,200, which would satisfy the debt with a small credit remaining. The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening. Delilah felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications sank in. Thomas's hidden debt was going to cost Ephraim everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built in preparation for their future together. "Let me see those documents," Ephraim said, extending his hand with carefully controlled movements. Morrison handed over the papers, and Ephraim examined them with the thoroughness of a man who understood that details mattered in legal proceedings. Delilah watched his face, noting the subtle tightening around his eyes as he read through the promissory note and supporting documentation. "This signature," Ephraim said finally, pointing to Thomas's name at the bottom of the note. "You're certain it's authentic?" "We had it examined by a handwriting expert in Sioux Falls. He confirmed that it matches samples of Mr. Marsh's signature from previous bank transactions." Morrison's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide his sympathy for their situation. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cutter. I know this comes as a shock." Delilah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. 1 month of marriage, 1 month of believing she'd finally found security and stability, and now Thomas's hidden debts were threatening to destroy everything again. "When does Blackwood want payment?" Ephraim asked. "Immediately. He's prepared to begin legal proceedings to claim the property if settlement isn't reached within 10 days. 10 days. Ephraim set the papers on the table, his expression unreadable. "And you're certain there's no legal recourse, no way to challenge the debt's validity?" "The documentation appears to be in order, Mr. Cutter. The witnesses are both still alive and willing to testify to the note's authenticity, unless you can prove fraud or forgery." Morrison let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implication was clear. Without evidence of wrongdoing, they would have no choice but to honor Thomas's obligation or lose everything Ephraim had built. After Morrison left, promising to delay Blackwood's legal action for as long as possible, Delilah and Ephraim sat in their kitchen, staring at the documents that threatened to upend their carefully constructed new life. "I'm sorry," Delilah said finally, her voice hoarse with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Ephraim. I never knew about this debt. Thomas never said anything about borrowing money from someone in Rapid City." "I know you didn't know." His response was gentle, without a trace of blame or accusation. "Thomas was probably trying to protect you from worrying about the risk he was taking. But now you'll lose everything because of his choices. Because of my past." She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your life. Delilah, look at me." When she didn't respond, he moved to kneel beside her chair, his large hands covering hers. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes, expecting to see anger or regret or disappointment. Instead, she found the same steady determination that had characterized everything about him since their first meeting. "This house is just wood and stone," he said firmly. "Important, yes, but not irreplaceable. What matters is that we face this together, that we don't let Thomas's debts destroy what we're building." "How can you say that? You spent 3 years building this place, preparing for the family you wanted to start. Now you'll lose it all because you married me." "I married you because I wanted a partner, someone to stand beside me through whatever challenges came our way. This is one of those challenges." He squeezed her hands gently. "We'll figure out a solution." "What kind of solution?" "We don't have $1,000, and we don't have 10 days to earn it." Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen window. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision already made. "We sell the cattle, all of them." "Your cattle?" Delilah stared at him in shock. "Ephraim, those animals represent years of work, your entire livelihood. You can't sell them to pay Thomas's debt." "I can, And I will. His tone brooked no argument. The herd's worth enough to cover Blackwood's claim and leave us something to start over with. Start over where? If we lose this house, then we'll build another one. Maybe not as grand, maybe not in as beautiful a location, but a home nonetheless. He rose to his feet, beginning to pace with the restless energy of a man forming plans. Land is cheap further west, in areas where other people are afraid to settle. We could file a claim, build something simple but solid. The casual way he spoke about abandoning everything he'd worked for, all because of her connection to Thomas's hidden mistakes, made Delilah's chest tight with guilt and something that might have been love. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you sacrifice so much for a marriage that's barely a month old?" He stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression so tender it took her breath away. "Because when I made my vow to you, I meant it. For better or worse, in prosperity and in want. This is the worst part, Delilah. This is where we prove that what we have is strong enough to survive whatever life throws at us. But your dreams, my dreams were about having a family, about building something lasting with someone I could trust and respect and maybe someday love." He came back to her, taking her hands in his once again. "The location doesn't matter. The size of the house doesn't matter. What matters is that we're together, that we face the future as a team." That night, as they lay in bed discussing the practical details of selling the cattle and liquidating their assets, Delilah found herself studying her husband's profile in the moonlight. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate widow facing another winter alone. Now she was a woman whose past mistakes threatened to destroy her husband's future, yet he spoke of their challenges as if they were shared burdens rather than her personal failures. "I don't deserve you," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes, you do." His answer was immediate, certain. "You deserve someone who'll stand by you when things get difficult, who won't abandon you when life proves messier than expected. That's what marriage means, Delilah. That's what love looks like when it's built on something stronger than just passion." As she drifted off to sleep, Delilah realized that Thomas's hidden debt might have cost them Ephraim's beautiful house and carefully planned future, but it had also revealed something precious, that their marriage was built on a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as Ephraim worked to liquidate his life's work with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. Word spread quickly through the territory that the Cutter cattle were for sale, and by the second day, prospective buyers were arriving to examine the herd and negotiate prices. Delilah watched from the kitchen window as her husband dealt with men who had been his friends and neighbors, their expressions mixing sympathy with the shrewd calculation of people recognizing a distressed sale. He showed no emotion as he discussed the animals he'd raised from calves, as he accepted offers that were lower than the cattle's true worth, simply because everyone knew he had no choice but to sell. Martha Henley arrived on the 3rd day, bringing news from town and a determination to help however she could. She found Delilah in the bedroom, carefully packing their belongings into the same trunks that had brought her to this house just over a month ago. "I heard about the debt," Martha said without preamble, settling herself on the edge of the bed. "The whole town's talking about it. Some folks are saying it's suspicious that this Blackwood character waited until after you remarried to come forward with his claim." "Suspicious how?" Delilah paused in her folding, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. "Think about it, Delilah. If Thomas really owed this man money, why didn't he pursue collection when Thomas first died? Why wait 2 years until you've married someone with assets worth claiming?" The implication sent a chill through Delilah's veins. "You think the debt might be fraudulent?" "I think it's awfully convenient timing." Martha's expression was grim. "Carl's been asking around, trying to find people who remember Thomas borrowing money that spring. Nobody recalls him mentioning a debt to anyone in Rapid City. But the handwriting expert confirmed Thomas's signature. Handwriting can be forged, especially if someone had access to documents with Thomas's real signature." Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Carl thinks we should wire the territorial marshal. Ask him to investigate before you lose everything." Delilah felt a flutter of hope, quickly tempered by practicality. "Even if the debt is fraudulent, we only have 7 days left before Blackwood can claim the property. How long would an investigation take?" "I don't know, but it's worth trying, isn't it? This house, this life, Ephraim Bulty, it's worth fighting for." Before Delilah could respond, they heard the sound of raised voices from the yard. Through the window, they could see Ephraim in conversation with a man neither of them recognized, a thin, well-dressed stranger whose expensive clothes and pale complexion marked him as someone from the city rather than the frontier. "That must be Blackwood," Martha whispered. "Come to survey his prize before he claims it." They watched as the conversation grew more heated, Ephraim's normally controlled demeanor showing cracks as the stranger gestured dismissively toward the house and outbuildings. Finally, Ephraim turned and strode toward the house, his face dark, with barely contained fury. "Delilah," he called as he entered, "could you join us outside, please? Mr. Blackwood has some questions about the debt." Jonathan Blackwood was everything Delilah had expected, and worsy man in his 40s, with the soft look of someone who'd never done physical labor, dressed in a suit that cost more than most families earned in a year. His eyes held the cold calculation of a predator, and when he looked at her, she felt as if he was cataloging her value as an asset. "Mrs. Cutter?" he said with false courtesy. "I'm sorry we have to meet under such unpleasant circumstances. However, business is business, and your late husband's debt must be satisfied." "My late husband never mentioned borrowing money from you," Delilah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I handled all our financial affairs. If Thomas had taken such a large loan, I would have known about it." Blackwood's smile was patronizing. "Perhaps your husband was protecting you from worry. Men often shield their wives from business concerns, especially when those concerns involve risk. Thomas and I had no secrets from each other. Nevertheless, the debt exists, properly documented and witnessed. I'm prepared to be generous in my terms. You can remain in the house until spring, giving you time to find alternative arrangements. I have no desire to turn a respectable family out into the winter cold." The false benevolence in his tone made Delilah's skin crawl. This man was enjoying their distress, taking pleasure in the power he held over their lives. "How convenient that you waited until now to collect," Ephraim said, his voice deceptively calm. 2 years after Thomas's death, just long enough for his widow to remarry someone with assets worth claiming. Blackwood's eyes sharpened. "I don't care for your implication, Mr. Cutter. I've been pursuing this debt through proper legal channels since learning of Mr. Marsh's death. These things take time, especially when the debtor's widow relocates and remarries." "Relocates? My wife lived in the same house for 2 years after Thomas died. You could have found her any time you wanted." "Perhaps, but as I said, legal proceedings take time." Blackwood pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time with theatrical precision. "Speaking of which, you now have 6 days to produce payment or surrender the property. I suggest you use that time wisely." After he left, Delilah and Ephraim stood in their yard, watching his expensive carriage disappear down the mountain road. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and growing suspicions. "He's lying," Delilah said finally. "Something about him, about this whole situation, it doesn't feel right." "I agree, but proving it is another matter entirely." Ephraim's jaw was tight with frustration. Martha mentioned something about contacting the territorial marshal. "She thinks we should request an investigation. Carl's been asking around town, and nobody remembers Thomas mentioning a debt to anyone in Rapid City." "It's worth trying." Ephraim turned toward the house, his expression determined. "I'll wire the marshal this afternoon, explain the situation, and request immediate assistance. At the very least, an official investigation might delay Blackwood's claim until we can gather more evidence." That evening, while Ephraim rode to town to send the telegram, Delilah found herself alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that their ordeal was far from over. She wandered through the house that had become home so quickly, touching familiar objects and trying to memorize details she might never see again. In the spare bedroom, she discovered something that made her heart skip of planks of wood, carefully shaped and sanded, the beginning of what would clearly become a baby's cradle. Ephraim had been working on it in secret, preparing for the child he still believed they would have together. The sight of the unfinished cradle, with its promise of future joy amid their current crisis, brought tears to her eyes. How could she tell him that her monthly courses had arrived that morning, right on schedule, proving once again that his confidence in her fertility might be misplaced? Martha found her there an hour later, sitting on the floor beside the cradlewood with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, honey," Martha said, settling beside her, "the debt isn't your fault. Thomas's choices aren't your responsibility. It's not just the debt." Delilah touched one of the smooth cradle rails, imagining Ephraim working by lamplight to create something beautiful for a baby that might never come. "I'm not pregnant, Martha. It's been 6 weeks, and still nothing. What if I can't give him the children he wants so desperately?" 6 weeks is nothing. Some women take months or even years to conceive, and they go on to have large, healthy families. But what if I'm one of the women who can't? What if that's why Thomas and I never had children, and Ephraim's confidence is misplaced? Martha was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Then you'll love each other for who you are, not for what you can produce. Look at what he's willing to sacrifice for you, already his house, his cattle, his plans for the future. That's not the behavior of a man who values you only for your childbearing potential." But children were part of his vow. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. What happens when winter comes, and I'm still empty? Then you'll face that disappointment together, the same way you're facing this crisis together." Martha reached over and squeezed her hand. "Delilah, I've watched you and Ephraim together these past weeks. What you have isn't just about making babysits, about building a partnership that can weather any storm." When Ephraim returned from town, he brought news that was both encouraging and frustrating. The territorial marshal had agreed to investigate Blackwood's claim, but the process would take weeks to complete. In the meantime, they were on their own to find evidence that might prove the debt fraudulent. "I also sent inquiries to banks and lending institutions in Rapid City," he told her as they prepared for bed. "If Blackwood is legitimate, someone will know about his business practices. If he's a fraud, that might come to light as well. And if we can't prove anything before the deadline, then we follow through on our original plan. Sell what we can, pay what we must, and start over somewhere else." He pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest with gentle strength. "Either way, we face it together." As they lay in the darkness, Delilah listened to the steady rhythm of her husband's breathing and tried to find comfort in his unwavering confidence. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the deadline, closer to losing everything he'd worked for. But it would also bring them closer to discovering whether their marriage was strong enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. In 6 days, they would know whether Jonathan Blackwood could claim their home. But tonight, in the warmth of Ephraim's arms, Delilah allowed herself to believe that some things, the most important things, couldn't be taken away by legal documents or fraudulent debts. "Ephraim," she whispered into the darkness. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made." His arms tightened around her. "Even if it costs me everything I've built?" "Even then, because what we're building together is worth more than any house or any amount of money." For the first time since Morrison had delivered the devastating news, Ephraim's tension seemed to ease. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Cutter. Tomorrow we fight for our future." The breakthrough came on the 5th day, delivered by a breathless rider who'd pushed his horse hard through the mountain passes. Carl Henley dismounted in their yard, with the urgency of a man carrying news that couldn't wait, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "We found him," he announced without preamble, striding toward where Ephraim and Delilah stood waiting on the porch. "We found the man who forged Thomas's signature." Delilah felt her knees go weak with relief. "Who?" "Remember Henry Walsh, used to work as a clerk at Morrison's bank before he was caught skimming from accounts." Carl pulled a crumpled telegram from his coat pocket. "He disappeared about 6 months ago, but the marshal tracked him down in Denver. When they threatened him with federal charges, he confessed to everything. Ephraim took the telegram, scanning its contents with growing satisfaction. Walsh admits to forging the promissory note. Every detail. Apparently, Blackwood approached him last year with a proposition: create false documentation of debts owed by recently deceased men whose widows had remarried into property. Walsh had access to bank records, knew Thomas's signature well enough to copy it convincingly. But the witnesses, Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison said there were 2 witnesses who could testify to the note's authenticity. Blackwood's accomplices. The marshal arrested all 3 men yesterday evening. Carl's grin was fierce with satisfaction. Walsh kept detailed records of their scheme, including a list of other families they'd targeted across the territory. You weren't the first, but thanks to your investigation, you'll be the last. The relief that flooded through Delilah was so intense it left her lightheaded. She reached for Ephraim's hand, needing the anchor of his steady presence as the reality of their salvation sank in. The debt is void, Ephraim said, more statement than question. Completely void. Blackwood has no legal claim to your property or anything else. In fact, he'll be lucky if he doesn't end up in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy. Carl folded the telegram carefully, treating it like the precious document it was. The marshal will be here tomorrow to take your statements and officially clear the matter. That evening, as they sat before their fireplace in the house that was truly theirs once again, Delilah found herself overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly, and gratitude for the friends who'd fought for them. But underneath those surface feelings was something deeper, a profound sense of how close they'd come to losing everything, and how much that loss would have meant. I keep thinking about the cradle, she said, watching flames dance in the hearth they'd thought they might never see again. What cradle? Ephraim's voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders. The one you've been working on in the spare room. The one you thought I didn't know about. She turned to study his profile, noting the flush that crept up his neck. Were you planning to surprise me with it? I was planning to finish it when we had reason to celebrate. He met her eyes, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. I didn't want to mention it until we knew for certain that you were carrying our child. The hope in his voice made her chest tight. How could she tell him that her body had once again failed to cooperate with his dreams? How could she destroy his faith in their future when they'd just reclaimed it from Jonathan Blackwood's schemes? Ephraim, she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. You're not pregnant. His statement was quiet, resigned rather than accusatory. How did you know? I've been watching for signs, hoping for changes that haven't come. He turned to face her fully, his large hands reaching for hers. I saw you washing linens last week that you shouldn't have needed if my seed had taken root. Heat flooded her cheeks at his frank acknowledgement of her monthly cycles. I'm sorry, I know how much you were hoping. Don't apologize. His interruption was gentle but firm. We've been married 7 weeks, Delilah. Some couples try for years before conceiving their first child. But your vow was made with hope, not certainty. I can't control when our children come, only how ready we are to receive them when they do. She studied his face, searching for signs of disappointment or frustration. Instead, she found only the steady patience she'd come to associate with everything about him. Are you angry that I haven't given you what you want most? What I want most is a marriage built on trust and genuine affection. Children will be a blessing when they come, but they're not the foundation of what we're building together. He squeezed her hands gently. Besides, there's something to be said for having time to learn each other before we add the complications of parenthood. Time to learn each other how? His smile held a warmth that made her pulse quicken. Time to discover what makes you laugh. Time to understand what you need from me as a husband, not just as the father of your children. Time to build the kind of partnership that will make us good parents when the opportunity arrives. And if it never arrives, if I'm truly barren, then we'll have built something beautiful anyway. He brought her hands to his lips, pressing soft kisses to her palms. Delilah, I didn't marry you just to get children. I married you because you're strong and honest and brave enough to trust a stranger with your heart. Those qualities don't disappear if babies don't come." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "I love you," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ephraim went very still, his eyes searching her face as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "Say that again." "I love you." This time she said it deliberately, with full awareness of what she was confessing. "I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between your first proposal and tonight, I fell in love with my husband. Delilah." Her name was a prayer on his lips as he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest with trembling hands. "I've been waiting to hear those words since the day I first saw you chopping wood in your yard. You loved me then, when I was just a desperate widow who needed rescuing. I loved your strength. I loved your refusal to give up, even when everything was against you. I loved the way you looked at me like I might be worth taking a chance on." He cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "And every day since then, I've found new reasons to love the woman you're becoming." When he kissed her, it was with a passion that had been building for weeks, no longer held in check by uncertainty or the need for patient courtship. This was the kiss of a man claiming his wife, of a woman finally ready to be claimed completely. They made love that night with an intensity that transformed their careful physical relationship into something approaching worship. For the first time, Delilah understood what Martha had meant about passion, about the kind of connection that went beyond duty or even affection. In Ephraim's arms, she discovered parts of herself that had been sleeping, waiting for the right man to awaken them. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the bed that had witnessed their gradual transformation from strangers to lovers, Ephraim traced patterns on her bare shoulder with gentle fingers. "I have something for you," he said, reaching toward the bedside table. "Another gift?" She turned in his arms, noting the nervous anticipation in his expression. "What's the occasion?" "The occasion of my wife telling me she loves me." He withdrew a small object from the drawer, holding it where she could see it in the lamplight. It was a ring knot, the simple silver band he'd given her at their wedding, but something far more elaborate. The gold was warm and rich, set with a small but perfectly clear diamond that caught the light like captured starfire. "Ephraim, it's beautiful, but you've already given me so much." This was my grandmother's ring, brought from Norway when she was barely 18 and in love with a man who promised to make her life an adventure. He slipped it onto her finger above her wedding band. The fit perfect, as if it had been made for her hand. She wore it for 60 years, through good times and bad, through the births of 6 children and the loss of 2. When she died, she made my grandfather promise it would go to the woman I chose to love. Delilah held her hand up to admire the ring, but her attention was caught by something else, the way the diamond sparkled, the way the gold seemed to glow in the lamplight, the way her heart felt too full for her chest to contain. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," she whispered. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," he corrected, then caught himself. "Not owned. The most beautiful thing I've ever been blessed to love." As she drifted off to sleep wearing her grandmother-in-law's ring and wrapped in her husband's arms, Delilah marveled at how completely her life had transformed. 2 months ago, she'd been a woman with no future beyond mere survival. Now she was loved, cherished, protected by a man who saw her worth when she'd almost forgotten it herself. Tomorrow would bring the martial and the official end to Blackwood's threats, but tonight belonged to them too, the love they'd discovered and the future they would build together, one day at a time. The territorial marshal arrived the next morning as promised, accompanied by 2 deputies and carrying enough official documentation to put Jonathan Blackwood behind bars for the rest of his natural life. Marshal William Hayes was a man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in places where civilization was still a new and fragile thing. "Mrs. Cutter." "Mr. Cutter," he said, accepting the coffee Delilah offered and settling into their kitchen with the weariness of a man who'd ridden hard through mountain passes. I'm here to officially inform you that all claims against your property have been voided. Jonathan Blackwood is currently in custody in Rapid City, along with his associates. What will happen to him? Delilah asked, still hardly able to believe their ordeal was truly over. Federal prison, most likely. Fraud across territorial lines carries serious penalties, and we've identified at least a dozen other families he targeted with similar schemes. Hayes consulted his notes, his expression grim. He made the mistake of choosing victims he thought were too isolated or powerless to fight back effectively. He didn't count on communities like yours rallying to investigate his claims. Ephraim leaned back in his chair, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. How extensive was his operation? Larger than we initially suspected. Blackwood and his accomplices had been running this scheme for almost 3 years, targeting widows who'd remarried into property throughout Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming territories. Your case was unique because you fought back, instead of simply accepting the loss. We had help, Delilah said, thinking of Martha and Carl, of Samuel Morrison's willingness to delay legal proceedings, of all the friends who'd refused to let them face the crisis alone. Indeed you did, and that help likely saved other families from similar victimization. Hayes accepted a second cup of coffee, then turned his attention to the stack of documents he'd brought. I'll need you both to sign statements for the official record, but after that, the matter is closed as far as you're concerned. They spent the next hour providing detailed accounts of their interactions with Blackwood, from his initial appearance at their door through his final arrogant visit. Hayes listened with the focused attention of a man accustomed to sorting truth from fabrication, occasionally asking questions that revealed the thoroughness of his investigation. One more thing, he said as he prepared to leave. Blackwood had kept extensive records of his targets, including assessments of their property values and vulnerability to legal intimidation. Your homestead was rated as a high-value, low-risk target. Low risk? Ephraim's eyebrows rose. Isolated location, recent marriage between strangers, limited community ties. He assumed you'd pay rather than fight, especially since the debt appeared legitimate on the surface. Hayes's smile held grim satisfaction. He seriously underestimated both your determination and your community's willingness to stand with you. After the marshal left, Delilah found herself standing in their kitchen, looking around at the home she'd thought they might lose forever. Everything was exactly as it had been before Blackwood's arrival, yet somehow it all seemed more precious now, the careful craftsmanship of Ephraim's furniture, the way morning light fell across the scrubbed wooden table, the view of mountains and meadows through windows that would never be claimed by fraudulent debts. "What are you thinking?" Ephraim asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about how close we came to losing all of this, how different our life would have been if we'd had to start over somewhere else. Different, but not necessarily worse." His voice was thoughtful, reflective. "We would have built something new together, made it beautiful in its own way." "Do you really believe that? That we could have been happy living in some rough cabin on unclaimed land?" "I believe we could be happy anywhere, as long as we were together." He turned her in his arms, so she was facing him. "The house doesn't make the home, Delilah. The people in it do." She reached up to touch his face, marveling at the certainty in his expression. "How did you get to be so wise?" 34 years of learning that most of what we think we need, we can actually live without. But the things we truly need, love, trust, companionship, those are irreplaceable. They spent the rest of the day in comfortable domestic routine, but with an undercurrent of celebration that made even ordinary tasks feel special. Ephraim worked on finishing the cradle he'd started, no longer keeping it secret now that they'd openly discussed their hopes for children. Delilah reorganized their pantry and began planning their first real Christmas together, thinking of the traditions they might create and the memories they would build. That evening, as they sat before their fireplace with the completed cradle between them, Delilah found herself studying the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Every joint was perfectly fitted, every surface sanded smooth as silk. The rockers were carved with the same wild roses that decorated the wooden spoon he'd made her, and the headboard bore their initials intertwined in a pattern that spoke of permanence and commitment. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the curved rails. "Any baby would be lucky to sleep in something so carefully made." "I keep imagining what it will be like," Ephraim admitted, his voice soft with longing. "Watching our child sleep, knowing we created something perfect together." The wistfulness in his tone made her chest tight. "Ephraim, what if?" "No." He reached over and took her hand, stilling her worried words. "No more what-ifs about children. They'll come when they're meant to come, and until then, we practice being the kind of people who deserve to be parents." "What kind of people is that?" "People who love each other enough to weather any storm. People who put their family first, no matter what challenges arise. People who know that the most important gift they can give their children is the security of parents who are truly committed to each other." As she prepared for bed that night, Delilah caught sight of herself in the mirror above their dresser and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who'd chopped firewood with bleeding hands just 2 months ago. This woman had color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes. This woman looked loved, cherished, secure in ways that went beyond mere financial stability. "I look different," she said as Ephraim joined her at the mirror. "You look happy." He stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders as they both studied their reflection. "You look like a woman who knows she's valued." "Is that what you see when you look at me?" "I see the strongest person I've ever known. I see a woman who faced losing everything twice and never stopped fighting for what mattered to her. I see the mother of my future children and the partner I want to grow old with." That night, as they made love with the slow tenderness of people who had all the time in the world, Delilah found herself thinking about the future Ephraim envisioned with such confidence. Children running through their house, filling it with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of family life. Grandchildren, perhaps, playing on the same floors where their parents had taken their first steps. It was a future worth waiting for, worth working toward with patience and hope. And if it never came exactly as they imagined, if their family remained just the two of them, that would be enough too. Because what they'd built together, this love, this partnership, this unshakable commitment to facing life as a team that was already more than she'd ever dared to dream possible. As she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, wearing her grandmother-in-law's ring and surrounded by the security of their reclaimed home, Delilah offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought Ephraim Cutter to her door. His bold promise about winter and babies had seemed impossible when he first spoke it, but now she understood that some promises are kept not through force of will, but through the patient nurturing of love that makes all things possible in time. Spring came early to the Dakota Territory that year, arriving in March with warm winds that melted the snow and set the mountain streams running high and clear. Delilah stood at their bedroom window, watching the first tentative buds appear on the apple trees Ephraim had planted the previous year, and pressed her hand to the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. The morning sickness had started in January, just after the worst of winter's grip had settled over their mountain home. At first, she'd attributed the nausea to something she'd eaten, but when it continued day after day, accompanied by an exhaustion that made her want to sleep 12 hours at a stretch, Martha had ridden through a snowstorm to confirm what Delilah had hardly dared to hope. "Ephraim," she called softly, not wanting to wake him too abruptly. "The sun's up." He stirred beside her, reaching automatically for her hand as he had every morning since learning about the baby. His palm settled over the curve where their child rested, and she felt his smile against her shoulder. "Good morning, little one," he murmured to her belly, a ritual that had developed over the past month. "Your mama and I are excited to meet you." 4 months along now, according to Martha's calculations, which meant their baby would arrive sometime in late summer. The timing felt perfect. She would have the warm months to recover from birth, and the child would be old enough to weather their first winter with relative safety. "I dreamed about him again," Delilah said, settling back into Ephraim's arms to enjoy these quiet moments before the day's work began. "Him?" Ephraim's voice held gentle teasing. "You're still convinced it's a boy?" "I'm convinced it's exactly what we need, whether that's a boy or a girl." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the early morning light. "But yes, I think it's a boy. I think it's Eric." The name they'd chosen for a son, combining Ephraim's grandfather's Norwegian heritage with her family's tradition of strong, simple names. If the baby proved to be a girl, they'd decided on Anna, after Delilah's mother. Eric Cutter. Ephraim spoke the name thoughtfully, as if trying it out. "I like the sound of that." "Just Eric? Not Eric Thomas?" She'd suggested giving their son Thomas's name as a middle name, a way of honoring the man whose death had ultimately led to her finding happiness with Ephraim. "If that's what you want. But I think Thomas would be more honored by our happiness than by having his name attached to our child." Ephraim's hand moved in gentle circles over her belly. "He loved you enough to want you to find love again, even if he couldn't have imagined it would happen the way it did." Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, evidence of Martha's visit the day before, when she'd helped Delilah prepare meals they could reheat easily during the busy spring planting season. The older woman had taken it upon herself to ensure that Delilah didn't overexert herself during pregnancy, arriving weekly with casseroles and advice and the kind of maternal fussing that Delilah had missed since her own mother's death. "You need to eat," Ephraim said, noting how she pushed her breakfast around her plate without taking more than a few bites. "The baby needs nourishment." The baby wants nothing to do with food this morning. She managed another spoonful of porridge, fighting down the nausea that still plagued her despite being well into her second trimester. "Maybe later." Martha said the sickness should pass soon. Martha says a lot of things, but she smiled as she said it, grateful for the friendship that had deepened during her pregnancy. Having another woman to share fears and hopes with made the whole experience feel less overwhelming. After breakfast, Ephraim headed out to begin spring planting, while Delilah tackled the lighter household tasks that still fell within Martha's definition of appropriate activity for expectant mothers. As she dusted the furniture they'd thought they might lose to Blackwood's fraud, she found herself thinking about how different this spring felt from the one that had changed everything. A year ago, she'd been a desperate widow, facing another growing season alone, uncertain whether she could produce enough food to last through another winter. Now she was a cherished wife, preparing to become a mother, secure in the knowledge that she would never face hardship alone again. The baby's first movements had started a few weeks ago, gentle flutters that she'd initially mistaken for indigestion. But now they were unmistakable, little pushes and rolls that reminded her constantly of the life growing inside her. When she shared these moments with Ephraim, his face would light with wonder and pride in a way that made her understand how deeply he wanted this child. That afternoon, while working in the kitchen garden they'd expanded for the coming year, Delilah was startled by the sound of approaching horses. A small group of riders was making its way up their mountain road, and she recognized Carl Henley in the lead, followed by what appeared to be several other families from town. "Ephraim," she called toward the fields where he was working, "we have visitors." The surprise turned out to be a baby celebration organized by Martha and carried out by their extended community of friends and neighbors. The women had brought Gifstony clothes, soft blankets, wooden toys carved by their husbands during long winter evenings. The men had collaborated on a larger project, a beautiful wooden rocking horse that would wait in the nursery until their child was old enough to appreciate it. "This is too much," Delilah protested, overwhelmed by the generosity and the clear evidence that their unconventional marriage had been fully accepted by their community. "Nonsense," Martha replied briskly. "Every baby deserves to be celebrated, and every mother deserves to know her community will support her family." As the afternoon wore on, with children playing in their yard and adults sharing news and gossip over coffee and cake, Delilah found herself thinking about the family they were creating, not just she and Ephraim and their coming child, but this larger network of people who cared about their welfare and celebrated their joys. "You look content," Ephraim observed that evening as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become home. "I am content." She settled more comfortably against his side, one hand resting on her belly where their child moved gently in response to his father's voice. "More than content. I'm grateful." "For what?" "For everything. For you having the courage to approach a stranger with an impossible promise. For me having the desperation to say yes. For all the challenges that proved we could weather anything together." She looked up at him, noting how the evening light softened his strong features. "For this little person who's going to make us a real family." "We were already a real family," Ephraim corrected gently. "The baby just makes us a bigger one." From their porch, they could see the garden they'd planted together, the pastures where his cattle grazed, the barn that housed the horses he was training for sale in the fall. It was a prosperous, well-managed homestead that showed the results of two people working toward common goals. But more than that, it was a home filled with love and laughter, and the daily evidence that their unconventional beginning had grown into something beautiful and lasting. The desperate widow and the lonely giant had found in each other exactly what they needed to build a life worth living. "I never thanked you properly," Delilah said, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "For what?" "For keeping your promise. You said that by winter I'd have your son growing inside me. Winter came and went, and I thought you'd been wrong. But you were just early. It was by spring instead of winter." Ephraim's hand joined hers on her belly, both of them feeling the active movements of their child, responding to their voices and touches. "The timing doesn't matter. What matters is that we kept faith with each other long enough for love to grow. And now we finish what we started." He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "We welcome our child. We raise him to be strong and kind like his mother. And we love each other through whatever comes next." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the security of the life they'd built from nothing more than mutual need and growing trust, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought of Thomas, whose memory she would always cherish, and of the grief that had nearly destroyed her. She thought of Ephraim's bold proposal and her desperate acceptance, of the challenges that had tested their commitment, and the love that had sustained them through every trial. Most of all, she thought about the baby who would arrive in a few months, the child who would never know a world where his parents didn't love each other completely, who would grow up secure in the knowledge that family meant standing together no matter what storms might come. The crazy promise that had started it all, "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you," had seemed impossible when Ephraim first spoke it. But promises, Delilah had learned, weren't always about timing. Sometimes they were about faith, about the willingness to believe that love could grow from the smallest seeds, that two lonely people could create something beautiful together if they were brave enough to try. As she drifted off to sleep that night in her husband's arms, with their child moving gently beneath her heart, and the security of their love wrapped around her like a blanket, Delilah Cutter knew that some promises were worth waiting for, and some fairy tales, the very best ones, began not with "once upon a time," but with a desperate woman, a determined man, and the courage to believe that happy endings were possible even in the harsh realities of frontier life. Outside their bedroom window, the spring wind whispered through the mountain pines, carrying with it the promise of summer warmth and autumn harvest, of a child's first cry, and a lifetime of love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. In the cradle beside their bed, the baby's first blanket waited a quilt sewn by Delilah during the long winter months, stitched with all the hope and love and dreams that had transformed a marriage of convenience into the kind of love story that people would tell for generations to come. The giant cowboy had kept his promise after all, just not in the way anyone might have expected. By spring, not winter, his wife carried their child. But more importantly, by the time spring arrived, they had built something far more precious than either had dared to hope for when they first stood before Reverend Morrison and promised to love each other through whatever trials lay ahead. They had built a family, they had built a future, They had built a love that would last through all the seasons of their lives, growing stronger with each passing year like the apple trees that would soon bloom in their mountain garden, bearing fruit for generations yet to come.